Hello, welcome everyone to this afternoon's session, which is people to power to the people, who gets to shape net zero. My name is Steve Brooks. I'm a member of the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales, and it's our job to advise Welsh ministers on Wales's long-term infrastructure needs. And by long-term, I really do mean long-term. We've got a remit to look up to 2100. I'll be chairing the session this afternoon, and I'll just kick off with a couple of housekeeping points before we start. The first is a reminder that the session is being translated, and I'd encourage everyone to speak clearly and slowly if you can. Please do post questions in the chat. We'll be coming to those questions in the second half of the session. So as you are hearing the speakers, if there's anything that jumps out at you in terms of a question or a comment, please do put that into the chat. I'm keen for the session to be as accessible and productive as possible, so it'd be great if people could perhaps minimize the use of techie language, and also perhaps when we're critiquing what's going wrong, we could also offer some ideas of what might put it right. That would be great. In a minute, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves and say a few short words of introduction, but I'll just kick off with a reminder that this year's theme for Wales Climate Week is on how we can make net zero transition fair, participatory and people powered. And in our session this afternoon, we're going to be exploring who really gets to shape net zero. So not just governments and quote experts, but also communities and civil society at large. You may have read the Welsh Government discussion paper. One thing that really jumped out from me is that a lot of the hard yards that have happened on decarb so far have been largely down to energy and industry sectors doing their bit on decarbonisation. And it says the next stage really to get to net zero is about what happens in people's daily lives. So I think it's no understatement to say we need to get this right, folks. To help us consider what right looks like and how we get there, we've got a lineup of really interesting speakers. We're going to go first name alphabetical, and I'm going to ask each of the panel to just introduce themselves and perhaps just offer a few words of reflection. And we'll kick off with Helen.
Hi, Steve. Pranam da. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi. I'm Helen Nelson. I'm the Director of Strategic Planning, Climate and Nature in the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. That means I oversee all of the work in relation to the Commissioner's mission, which is around supporting public bodies on their journey to deliver against climate and nature targets. And I'm really glad to be here today. This is a topic that we're very interested in. Who gets to shape net zero? Clearly, it has to be a collective effort with government, public bodies, experts, academics, but communities and people have such an important role to play. And it's not just about how we can facilitate better involvement, but I also think it's how we make sure the communities have real ownership on this agenda. And I mean ownership in every sense of the word, where there's real ability to empower and to just maximize the creativity of communities in coming up with solutions for that area, and making sure that there's financial benefits, and we're seeing real benefits in Wales. So yeah, interesting topic area.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. Rossio.
Hello, can you see and hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I'm really pleased to be taking part in Wales Climate Week, and especially excited to be part of this session titled Power to the People. And as Children's Commissioner for Wales, my job is all about making sure that children's rights are protected and promoted. And one really important children's rights is children's rights to be heard and to influence decisions that relate to their lives. We know, and I know from the work that I do with children and young people, that they really care deeply about climate issues and are also taking loads of important action in their schools, in their communities, to tackle climate change and the climate emergency. We know that children are really worried about changing climate, and in a survey that my office carried out in 2022, over 10,000 children responded, and the climate and the planet was one of the biggest things that they were worried about. So we are really, being told in no uncertain terms what children are worried about, why they're worried about the climate, and what they want to see happen as a result. I really call on adults, decision makers, to do what they're meant to do and have, hold children's best interests at heart and act on the concerns that children are raising and do the things, because we have many of the solutions. So do the things that children are asking for. So happy to go into some of those solutions in a bit more detail in the session.
Brilliant, thanks, Rocio. Sarah?
Hi everybody, it's a real pleasure to be part of this panel today. My name's Sarah Allen. I'm an independent specialist in what I would call public engagement in decision making. So that means when national government, when local government, when public bodies and others want to make decisions with people rather than do things to them. So when they're opening up their strategy development processes, their policy development processes, to really work with the communities that they serve. Have a particular focus on public engagement on climate issues. I ran Climate Assembly UK for the UK Parliament and have run similar processes and dissimilar processes for a huge range of bodies across the UK. The reason I've been asked to be on this panel, though, is that I am also a member of the Welsh Government's Innovating Democracy Advisory Group. So if you haven't heard of IDAG, as it's known, it's been set up by the Deputy First Minister to follow up on some of the recommendations of the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. And one of the things that we're considering as a group is exactly how innovations that give people power over decisions, like climate decisions, can be embedded in how Wales works. I should say, however, that the opinions that I'm going to express today are very much mine and not that of the IDAG membership or group. My initial reflections on the topic are quite simple, really, and that's that enabling people to help shape net zero is really fundamental to achieving net zero itself. So we often talk about how climate policies can help make people's lives better. We paint this beautiful future where everyone is leading these idyllic lives, and climate policies can help make people's lives better, but that's by no means guaranteed. If we design policies poorly, if we focus on the wrong areas first, then climate change can quickly seem part of an elite agenda that has very little to do with the kind of predominant struggles that people are facing in their lives. So one of the things that kind of often gets pushed back at me when I talk about public engagement is decision making is, net zero is an emergency and we don't have time for that. But actually what we really don't have time for is to lose the support of people for climate action. And that is my opening thought.
Brilliant. Thank you. My plea to participants is, as I say, as we're having this conversation, if there are questions that are coming to the forefront of your mind, please do pop them in the chat, and we will hopefully have time to ask the panel to respond to them. I'm going to open up with quite a broad question, really, which is how we start these big kind of conversations with people, and how do we begin the process of shifting power. And perhaps I'll go back first to Sarah, who we've just heard from. Sarah, you mentioned you work on citizen assemblies across the UK. What have you learned around building trust and legitimacy on big policy issues, things like the transition to net zero?
I think I've learned that when you engage people and you treat them with respect and you treat them as partners, that you can build that trust, that you can get that input to your decision making, and you can gradually build that process of mutual understanding. So one of the things that we see in citizens assemblies, but I think is true of other engagement methods as well, is you start to see people appreciate the role of, say, their local government much more. So you hear people say, we didn't realise that they didn't have the power to do that, or we didn't realise that they were facing this challenge over here. And that beginning of mutual understanding the other way as well, so kind of the decision making, the people in local government begin to understand the concerns of the kind of their communities kind of even better, and why they think the things they do on certain issues. That beginning of mutual understanding is where the trust then grows from, and we see that in citizens assemblies and we see it in other methods too.
perhaps I should have asked before that is what are citizen assemblies? It's kind of, we've bound around lots of terms around deliberative democracy and public engagement, but for you, what makes a good citizen assembly? What are the characteristics of it?
So a citizen assembly, so people know, it's a very particular engagement method. So it involves bringing together what is usually a reflective sample of the population to really look at an issue in depth and then reach to find out where they can find common ground and reach recommendations about what they think should happen. They are a really in-depth method. And I think what makes a good citizens assembly is there are some sort of generic things. So first of all, making sure that they're focused on an area where the commissioning body, be that local government, is really open to hearing people's views and really open to taking those recommendations forward. That's obviously a really key thing. And then there's all sorts of things that are common to other types of engagement about starting where people are at, making sure information is accessible, making sure that you're kind of recompensing people for their time, making sure that the opportunity to take part is accessible to a wide range of people. But I think the more interesting question really around citizens' assemblies is when are they suitable methods and when are they not? Because at the moment they get kind of very much overused, I would say. So if you look at their original purpose, citizens' assemblies were very much created to help councils and national government and others deal with really thorny issues where they're stuck. So if you look, and you have to excuse me, I'm probably the only panelist here that doesn't live and work in Wales, but I also am not sure there is a really good example of this from Wales on the Citizens' Assembly. So the Devon Climate Assembly, to inform their climate plan, they did a huge amount of wider engagement with the public on climate change, and they found there was actually quite broad agreement on lots of areas, but they found 3 areas of particular contention, so around onshore wind, around how to reduce car use, and one other. And then they focused their citizens' assembly, this really intense engagement with a reflective group of their population, on how to take forward progress on those issues in particular, whether people could reach agreement, and kind of under what conditions they'd support those policy issues. So I'd say citizens' assembly, its best use is where you as a decision maker, or people as a commissioner, really have a really thorny issue that's controversial, that you want to understand the views of a representative group of your population on. But there are many, many, many other methods. I mean, perhaps Steve will get onto this later, but around co-creation and legislative theatre, which we can define for you all, that provide other ways to engage people that might be more suitable in certain situations.
It would be good to do that, actually, and kind of perhaps delve a little bit deeper on what are the alternatives and when and how are they best used. Let's move to Helen next. Helen, you're from the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner. I just wondered, from a future generations perspective, how do you kind of balance all of the kind of different competing kind of demands, I suppose, because we're talking about how we involve the public in net zero, but wrapped into that are issues around fairness, so fair work, and tackling poverty and inequality. We've also got things like the nature recovery. How do you balance all of these kind of competing issues, which perhaps might feel a little contradictory perhaps sometimes?
Yeah. I think that's a really key question to ask, Steve. So to start off, I think it is important to anchor the conversation in that in Wales we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's framework legislation which gives Welsh ministers, local authorities, health boards and lots of other organisations the legal duty to maximise their contribution to 7 wellbeing goals. Wellbeing, which is defined in environmental wellbeing, resilient Wales, social and cultural wellbeing and economic wellbeing. And so we're not talking here at net zero at any cost, or roads at any cost, or housing at any cost. We're talking about how you do balance those different types of well-being, which makes for a complete, good life, a complete good community, a complete good country. And it's quite hard to do that. And certainly I think we need to have a better capacity for integrated decision making, not just within local government, but also within national government. So when you're driving forward your actions for net zero, you're really understanding and unpicking how they're influencing nature recovery, how they're influencing food resilience, how you're creating green jobs and skills, and how you're achieving strong, cohesive communities with fair work. So looking So all decision makers need to look at addressing climate change within that really wide perspective, and that perspective is unique in Wales. And I think there's lots that's been done to make those connections, which we've seen in the discussion paper the Welsh Government have put up, links to housing, links to transport. But I think there's a lot more that we need to do to understand how those trade-offs are made, and how we use land in particular as well, how we use land so we can have new housing, we can make sure nature recovers, we can have food resilience, and we can have the net zero infrastructure that we need. And I think balancing those different land uses is really, really key.
Yeah. And of course, your office does a lot of work with public bodies to help them kind of live, breathe and eat the Future Generations Act. I'm just imagining if I worked for a public body and say I was responsible for coming up with the net zero plan, trying to weave in other considerations like the economy or nature might be a tall order. But then if I'm also being asked to involve the public, I'm kind of going out on a limb on that.
Well,
isn't that quite a change?
No, it's one and the same thing, Steve. It's one and the same thing, because when you go out to the public, and I can give us just an absolutely great example on this. When you go to the public, they know their own community and they see it all in a holistic sense. I live in Mumbles, I'm on the community council. You see it in a holistic sense. You understand what the connections are between environment, strong community, etc. And when you look at the community of Borth, we recently we went and met some communities in Borth. They were looking for a long-term plan for during COVID, a time of crisis. They said, let's develop a long-term plan for our community. And they looked at all of those things going on. And when you see what they've achieved and they're achieving through culture, through solar panels on a community centre, making the links with the NHS, they've got solar panels now powering the local GP surgery that was due for closure, help saving the GP surgery. When you go into a community, they are the ones that make these connections. And I think that's where, community wealth building and community involvement, I feel, really plays such a strong role in the net zero agenda, because they're the ones who will see those connections. And you don't always see those in national government or as a developer. So I think that speaks so well to the theme we're working on today.
Yeah. And Rostio, you talked about the children's right to be heard. Have you got any kind of comments or reflections on how well Wales historically has been doing since perhaps 1999, but also just thinking about how do we make that a kind of a meaningful conversation?
Yeah, good question. So Wales is world leading in one sense in respect of its commitments to children's rights, and within that, the rights to listen directly to children and young people. It was the first country in the UK to introduce the role of a Children's Commissioner, and then it was the first UK country to incorporate the UNCRC into part of its legislation in 2011 when it passed the Children's Measure, which made it a duty on Welsh Government ministers to consider children's rights in all of their decision making. So we've got great legislation, and it says that we need to listen to children and young people, and there's also a duty on local authorities to ensure that children and young people can participate in decisions that affect them. So there's loads of good, pockets of good practices going on the ground and across local authorities. Children and young people are being asked on their opinion about certain things sometimes, but I think it's very selective when and how, basically the powers that be are kind of, pick and choose when they want to listen to children and young people and when they don't. And that's a problem. And I think particularly because there is such consensus on the topic of climate and net zero, that children and young people want action, and they want action in specific areas that are more directly relevant to their lives, which would have a really transformative effect. But those actions aren't being taken by and large, with a few exceptions. So I think there is reason to be optimistic, and there is a real good potential for progress, but we really need to move quickly now and realise that potential, use those opportunities that exist. Children and young people want action to make it easier for them to use public transport and not rely on a car, for example. They all want that because it's going to help them get to their school, get to the local football club, get to meet their friends. They want that public transport to be better, more effective, more accessible, but also cheaper and free, ideally. So that's one thing that I've been calling for. They want it to be, they want action to be taken, for example, around school uniform rules. There's been great examples that I've seen of school uniform recycling setups that different schools have set up, and they've made it really, where these have been established, they've done it in such a way that it's helping the environment, obviously, by reducing more clothes from being bought, but it's also helping families who are struggling financially. But because it's being set up as a kind of cool recycle thing rather than a financial based action, it's sort of being there's less stigma around that school uniform recycling. And it's not just school uniform. I've seen examples of prom outfits being recycled and reused, and also football boots and so on. So there's really good things happening, but we need more of those, and for them to be joined up, and for the bigger, more difficult, maybe more expensive things like free public transport, for example, to also be taken forward as a serious consideration and a serious action.
Yeah, I'll perhaps ask all of you the same question, but stay with Rossio for now, which is how do we make the good stuff happen more and more frequently? And again, I think you touched on there's examples of where there is progress being made and some good practice, which is welcome. But I think a question you had about, are we doing enough, particularly on some of the big issues like net zero? So I suppose, Rosso, what do we need to do to kind of see that kind of shift, that kind of sea change in practice in Wales?
I think we need to accept that our current approach to listening to children is still at the early stages, and is often we're just listening, but we're not acting on those concerns or acting on those recommendations. So there's a risk really that engagement is still relatively tokenistic. We need to be, we need to really commit to taking children and young people's voices much more seriously, and we need perhaps legislation to change to reflect that. So, for example, the Welsh Youth Parliament have done loads of work on this topic, on climate and on free public transport, and they, it's fantastic that we have a Welsh Youth Parliament, but they don't really have much power ultimately, and Welsh Government doesn't have there is no requirement currently on Welsh Government to even respond formally to the reports that they produce. So they can say whatever they like really, and Welsh Government doesn't have to listen to them. So I think that is an example of something that could change and could lead to children and young people having, more power in reality, not just being able to say things.
Would it be fair for me to say it feels like at the moment in Wales, where we are listening to what children and young people want, we are listening because we have to, rather than because we want to, and we value what it is we are hearing?
Yes, I think there is a real will. I think a goodwill, and can't underestimate the importance of the very progressive landscape we have in Wales, and there is a real disposition to engage with children and young people and listen to them. But I think we have yet to take the steps where we really actually take seriously what they are saying and treat children and young people as equals and with the respect that they are due, and as experts in their own lives, ultimately. You know, they are the ones who really know how it feels to be a child or young person, and also what solutions would help other children and young people of their age. So we have to still take that step. I don't think we've done that yet. Yeah.
And Helen, in terms of the future generations, I won't ask you, have you sorted it? Because the Act has been on the statute book now for 10 years. It would be unfair for me to say that. But I just wonder, have you got any reflections in terms of how public bodies and others who are perhaps working aligned to the Act have made improvements broadly in public engagement? Because, of course, involvement is one of the 5 ways of working, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Steve. So as in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, as well as having the 7 wellbeing goals that all public bodies have to kind of aspire to work towards, you've got what's known as the 5 ways of working, which is, you know, equally as important, which is the how public bodies, including Welsh ministers, need to work towards achieving those goals. And those 5 ways of working include involvement, collaboration, working preventatively, thinking long term, and joining things up, integration across issues. So those ways of working are so important. And you know, I would concur there with what Rossio has said, because there is good stuff happening, but we've got a long way to go. And I noticed a phrase in the discussion document the Welsh Government circulated, which I really welcomed. And the phrase was that they're working towards deliberative democracy and place-based governance. That's what they said in the document, that the Welsh Government want to see more of: deliberative democracy and place-based governance. And to me, you know, that is really key, because could you really say that deliberative democracy and place-based governance is what's driving decision-making around net zero? I don't think you could, actually. You know, that's not an easy thing to achieve, but I think anchoring themselves in that direction, you know, I feel we would really welcome. There's obviously really good things going on, and you know, I want to talk about the role of town and community councils as well. You know, that's a very mixed bag, but have such an important role to play in driving forward and delivering on this agenda alongside the bigger public bodies. So a lot more to go, but if we're focusing on that deliberative democracy piece, which is, if you look at the participation ladder, that concept of there's a spectrum of different ways of involving communities, from, you know, information, education, consultation, to then the stronger involvement areas that are co-production. You know, that is where we need to be taking people on. We need to be working our way up that participation ladder into the mechanisms like gyfrannu, which I just put, you know, in the chat. You know, working with town and community councils, local authorities, social enterprises, all sorts of organisations that are going to know how we can develop this further in across Wales.
And when you said, you quoted deliberative democracy and place-based governance, I'm just mindful, I'm in Canton in Cardiff at the moment, so I sit near the River Ely. We're potentially prone to flooding. Deliberative democracy and place-based governance might seem quite kind of jargonistic and a million miles away from my life if I'm worried about how resilient my part of Cardiff is against flooding. How do we mirror this kind of work which institutions, or align this kind of work that institutions might be doing with some of the day-to-day concerns of the general public?
I think that's, you know, you're absolutely right. That is you know, very jargony, that phrase, isn't it? But when you sort of, you know what it means, and the work that the National Infrastructure Commission did, Steve, obviously in Grangetown, in relation to your most recent report, I think you showed there that by using different methodologies to involve people, which obviously Sarah can speak at, using different methodologies, moving away from this idea of a 500-page consultation document as being the way that people are, you know, invited into these conversations, moving away from that into smaller groups, into groups that have visual aids, use creativity. That is where you're going to get the interest and people making the connections with their own lives. So I thought that, you know, that report that was published by the National Infrastructure Commission, that had a lot of really interesting learning there.
Thanks. That checks in the post. You reminded me as well, I didn't expect to kind of reference Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger today. Of course, he did quite a lot in terms of sustainable development when he was in charge of California, and he's written some quite interesting, I think, reflections on initially in his first term when he was talking about infrastructure and things around resilience. Just he found it impossible to engage people, but actually when they started to shift the language and talk more in brass tacks, then they witnessed a kind of a shift in where the public were at, what their understanding was of some of the long-term risks, how they could be involved in some of the kind of statewide decisions.
Can I just add this, Steve? I do think language is important, and we are very jargony. There's so much jargon in the sector. One of the phrases that everyone knows in the office that I really don't like, right? I do not like the phrase just transition. If I went out on Mails Road today and asked any of my neighbours what that meant, nobody would have a clue. So we need to be talking in real ways in Wales so people can relate to everyday decisions. I think that's really important. I probably should admit that I don't like that term.
Let's put a pin in that, because I think we will probably kind of come back, because I'm kind of keen to explore some of the more practical elements of how do we actually make this happen. And I think using the right language is a key part of that. I'll move to Sarah, and just again, any kind of comments or reflections from you in terms of what do we need to do to kind of see this shift, this sea change in practice?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the issue that the Innovating Democracy Advisory Group is looking at. If we agree that these things are desirable, how do we get there? And we haven't reached conclusions on it yet. So again, these are just my opinion. These are just my opinions. But I think one of the key things is how we get people to shift from seeing these things that are a kind of additional thing that they have to do on top of kind of an already busy job, or perhaps even a challenge to their power, to seeing the real benefits that these ways of doing things can have in enabling people to move together and to move further. So you were asking me before, Steve, I think about the benefits of the citizens assemblies as one example. I think I slightly misunderstood your question. So to go back to that as an example of what we the challenge of what we need to get people to understand is that methods like that provide an opportunity to get a reflective group of people in the room, people who may never normally vote, people who may never normally engage, who aren't the people who might proactively get in touch with you as a local government or as national government or as a public body, to who might have more extreme views at either end of the spectrum, to give them a chance to learn about an issue, to give them a chance to understand each other's perspectives, and then to come out with a shared conclusion about where they feel action can happen, what form they think it should take, and how to better communicate that to other people like them. So there you have a real nugget, a real really high quality input for decision makers who are trying to look at how to take things that are potentially challenging for their communities forward. And that can only be a helpful thing, and can really if it means you're getting policies, which it should, that you're getting policies that work properly first time, if it means that you're communicating those policies better, if it means that you're avoiding pitfalls that might sound like a really good idea on paper from a policy perspective that land very badly with the people that they're aimed at. All of that is so helpful to decision makers. So how do we get people to understand that? How do we get people to understand that by opening up your decision making in the way Helen and others were talking about, and really taking that input seriously, that actually it's going to move you forward, it's going to empower you as someone who normally has some power already, but it's really going to empower you to make that change. And that's, it's not how institutions have necessarily traditionally worked, and maybe it's not how elected representatives, if we're talking about government, have originally conceived of their role. But how, so how do we change that impression? Is it by getting people to try this in a policy area, pilot things for their organisation and see how that works? Is it through support that can be provided? Is it through Welsh Government showing leadership and trialling these things in a high profile way? What is the way forward on this?
You reminded me, we both were involved in, I think it was Blaenau Gwent Council who did Citizens Assembly, and they were looking at transport in the county borough. And I only went to one session. I think you went to far more. I think you might have actually ran the whole programme or had a key part in it. But I think one of the takeaways for me was just the talking to the local authority and how useful that process was for them. I don't know if you can share any insights or observations you've had where you've perhaps been working with an organisation, be it a public body or perhaps an infrastructure provider, who perhaps have been a little bit sceptical about doing this at the beginning, but actually through the process, they've actually found it to be really useful, and probably would recommend it to others.
I mean, I think there are a lot of examples like that. So let's talk about blind event. I'm not sure they were kind of more skeptical than anyone else's at the beginning, but I think what you always get is that kind of a slight nervousness. Are people going to recommend things that are outside of our control, outside of our power? Are people going to recommend things that are completely unrealistic in terms of the budgets that we have available? Will people turn up? Will they engage constructively? If we come and speak as a council, are they just going to shout at us? And through the process, you see that kind of really transform those opinions and really change. And they realise that if they set up their engagement properly, if they kind of explain to people kind of what was within their power, what's not, what resources are available, and you have this kind of exchange of ideas with people, that people really kind of engage meaningfully in topic. They engage constructively with people from the council and officials when they attend the sessions. And what we're seeing what you get then is this kind of suddenly people want to come and observe the citizens assembly or citizens panel. When it's happening, suddenly they're inviting the panel members to come and talk at meetings about what it is that they've found, and that skepticism evaporates, and you end up like you did in Blaenau Gwent, with the officers who were involved in talking about exactly how useful that was to them, how they've understood kind of where they can move forward within budget. So for context, the question in Blaenau Gwent that people were considering, what the council and others very locally in Blaenau Gwent can do to help kind of shift transport habits and behaviours in the next few years without kind of much bigger, wider infrastructure changes that they know people in Blaenau Gwent would like to see. So that's potentially kind of a really challenging area where you're asking people to change things without, a magically transformed public transport service. So it's a really thorny issue. And what they found was that there were some really clear way forwards and pathways identified, which are things that the council can take forward and work on.
I think even though I've bought into this kind of process, I think I was really surprised at the extent to which the session that I contributed to, people kind of drove it themselves. Obviously, there was a facilitator there. I kind of expected there'd be a lot more, what's the council ever done for us? And people perhaps kind of coalescing in a very kind of critical way against the council. But actually, that wasn't the conversation at all. You actually found participants were debating with each other, were kind of sense checking with each other, were saying, well, don't forget the council hasn't been able to do this because of that. It was much more kind of fluid and balanced.
Yeah, and I think it shows that when you trust people, people also talk about members of the public lacking trust in public institutions, but the same is absolutely true the other way around. Public institutions often lack trust in the public. But when you trust people and you say, look, here's a shared problem, we want to work on it with you, people take like an enormous sense of responsibility and sort of pride and care in how they take forward that work. So the sessions in Blaenau Gwent, I think it was 3 Saturdays that people came to, and people only didn't come if they were like genuinely ill. We've retained kind of all the panel members during that time, but even if you look at the longer processes, the Climate Assembly UK happened over, I think in the end, because it was disrupted because of COVID, over 8 weekends. It was an enormous commitment, and we started with 110 people. Before COVID started, we had only dropped to 108 after the first 3 weekends. And even with COVID, membership stayed at over 100 throughout the assembly process. When you trust people, they really deliver back in spades, and they want to stay involved afterwards as well. If we're talking about how kind of opening up your decision making can kind of move beyond that process and the people who are actually engaged with the local council or national government, people really want to continue that involvement afterwards, which is kind of a really positive sign, I think.
Brilliant. Don't forget, everyone, we've already had a few kind of questions and comments in the chat. Please do kind of keep them coming, because I will come to them in a few minutes. There is a technical question from Andrew Schofield who says, can we see who else is in the room? Obviously, no disrespect to Rocio, Sarah, Helen or Steve, none taken. I'm not sure if that is technically possible, but if it is, I'm sure somebody is looking at it. We're going to move to the future and just think about what does good look like? We've spoken about some of the benefits, some of the kind of practical barriers that exist at the moment to having a kind of a people-powered push to net zero. But I'm just kind of interested in what the panel think in terms of what good could look like in Wales, perhaps in 2030 and 2050. Maybe you could give us a flavour of what, for most of the audience's professionals, what would be different if we were doing this better? Perhaps I'll come to you first, Helen.
Do you mean what would be different in terms of engagement, or
what would good feel like? What would it look like? What would getting this right? What would success look like if we nailed it?
Yeah. I think those deliberative engagement and other involvement spaces is, I just think they're so key, like I just put in the chat, because that dialogue is happening out there, and then it ends up happening on social media, and that can be really loud in a community when you've got very dominant voices. So I think we need to create those spaces to have more deliberative thinking through and more collaboration between people. So I think more opportunities like the Blaenau Gwent example that Sarah's given, like the gyfrannu example. And, you know, we're not always starting from a blank canvas. I think it's really important to build on the anchor organisations that are out there in the community, whether that's a local business, as, you know, a really key part, or a local rugby club, or, you know, a local football club, or any sort of organisation. So I think local WI, Merched Wow. So working within those networks that already exist, I think is really important, and not feeling like you're starting from a blank canvas every time. Yeah. And I think visibly seeing these positive changes in your community, I think is really important, and just really getting on with developing some of those projects, going back to both again, or you've got Egni Co-op, working with Pembrokeshire Council to put solar panels on almost every school and leisure centre across the whole of Pembrokeshire. You know, those projects where you're seeing schools benefiting, you're seeing your public services, your NHS, local GP surgery with a wire from the Borth Art Centre, seeing those projects proliferate across Wales in the small scale, I think is really essential to the good involvement, because people, you know, it's just better. People are seeing it and they like it, as opposed to just seeing really big controversial projects. It polarizes people, and the smaller projects don't do that, and they bring a wider range of benefits as well, benefits to local trades, you know, electricians, etc. So that's my vision of spaces for this dialogue to happen in a constructive way, where you bring people together. I don't think, you know, you get, as a community councillor, you get loads of people giving you flack quite a lot of the time. And I don't think if someone came to my front door, I don't think they'd talk to me like that. I think the conversation would be so much better if it was face to face than the sort of kind of bang, you know, sort of kind of quite nasty comments you get on social media. So bringing people together, having those spaces, and seeing those small projects proliferate in communities, I think that's my vision.
Brilliant. Rossio, I mean, a lot of what you were talking about is part of an international framework. When we're thinking about what good would look like in Wales in 2030 and beyond, maybe 2050, is there anywhere in the world that's kind of nailing this for children and young people?
I don't know the answer to that question. I was thinking more.
We can be the first then.
Sorry?
We can be the first.
Well, we like I said, we are further ahead than many places in terms of the legislation and the potential that I think that we have to really properly listen to children and young people. But I think we do, like I've already said, we need to go beyond listening and really. I would love by 2030 for children and young people to be much more meaningfully involved in this conversation on climate and how we achieve net zero. I think it's already been asked in the chat how many children and young people are in this session. Obviously, they might be in school, but nevertheless, I would, you know, love for these conversations to be taken with children and young people, not just talking about them. And for that to happen, I think there needs to be real investment in children and young people, and there needs to be, you know, they need to be facilitated to be part of these conversations through, for example, more formal links to schools, to school councils, to youth councils, but also through consideration of creating more apprenticeship opportunities in this space, to invest more in green careers. Young people are really interested in this topic, but they need to be supported, and the structures need to be there for their participation and for their ideas to be listened to and to be maximized. I think there's a risk if we don't actually create those proper structures, that we just continue to talk amongst adults and come up with solutions that maybe seem perfectly sensible to us, but times move so quickly that we really need to make sure that we're actually talking to the generation and the group who climate change is going to affect the most. They are already living with the consequences of climate change. It's not a futuristic concept. It's a present reality for children and young people when when the football games are called off because of rain again for the 12th time in a row, or when their schools are too hot because they haven't been future-proofed. So actually building in the structures to make children and young people be able to be part of these conversations and to co-produce, another kind of overused buzzword, but I think really actually bringing that concept to life and bringing children and young people into the room, but also not just expecting them to come into the adult spaces, but actually looking at more creative ways and new ways of reaching out to the spaces that children and young people are using more and more. It's easy to kind of dismiss social media as, that's just where kind of people just go to waste time or where misinformation happens. But we need to, I think about how we can use social media for good and harness its potential. Go on TikTok, Snapchat, if that's where the conversation is happening. We have to connect children and young people to this conversation. I think at the moment it's far too disconnected.
Important point there. One key kind of reflection from me is we've spoken a lot about the need to kind of have conversations with the public, with communities, about how we get to net zero. But I suppose what you're saying is actually sometimes we need to let those conversations run themselves. It needs to be other people's conversations. We're not necessarily the conveners of those conversations. Those conversations are being had anyway, and we need to be mindful of that. Sarah, let's suppose it's 2050 and we're still doing Wales Climate Week. We're doing a session on how did Wales nail this over the last 25 years. What do you think we need to have done in order to be able to claim to be a world leader in public engagement and participation on tackling the climate emergency?
So I'd say we'd be looking at two key things in particular. So one is that making decisions with people would be the norm. So we talked about the kind of way of working of involvement under the Future Generations Act. That would be how things are normally done in decisions about climate change and related to climate change. That's the first thing. And actually, I'll cheat and have a sort of thing that's related to that and pretend it's the same point, so that I don't go back on saying that it was two things. But I think it's also very easy when we think about kind of opening up decision making. Excuse me, to just think about what government can do. But actually, I can't see who's on this call, but if here we have people who make policy suggestions to government, for example, are they engaging the public in their own work to make sure that the suggestions they're putting forward are kind of ones that are going to work for government, that are grounded in what people think?
Is it perhaps having that pre-conversation to kind of rather than
I'm sorry, I'm not very well today. But is that having that pre-conversation? So it's not all on the government here. It's as people who are climate policy professionals and working in civil society, it's stress testing those suggestions that you're putting forward, making sure that you really understand where people are at as well as it being about government and government's ways of working and public institutions' way of working, that it certainly is. And then the second part of that, so if that's about opening up decision making, so in 2050, if that, opening up decision making, if that was the normal way things happened, that would be one thing. And the second thing is, I think it's about how we fund community groups that are perhaps not explicitly or not at all climate focused. So your faith groups, your sports groups, your kind of just local community organisations, to have these conversations about climate change and to support people with what were normally seen as the co-benefits of climate change, but for a lot of people are the actual benefits of some of this action. So kind of warmer homes, better protection from flooding, kind of available, a cheap, available, healthy food. How we can get those going in spaces where the starting point isn't climate change, actually, and in spaces where people trust people, so that people can see that these things that we're talking about getting to net zero, are actually things that are going to help them with the issues that are at forefront of their minds, if you see what I mean, at forefront of their daily struggles. So we'd have this like amazingly like 2050, we've got a bit of time, we'd have this amazingly diverse and rich layer of community engagement that was making direct, tangible benefits to people, that was making climate action on climate change, even if not framed like that, seem very normal to people, and seem directly beneficial to their lives. And then the kind of the policy framework that's surrounding that would have been informed by people, because decisions would be made with people, not to them, not done to them.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to go through let Sarah grab a glass of water if needed. I'm going to go through some of the questions and comments, of which we have had a load, which is brilliant. What I'll probably do is just kind of canter through them and then go back to the panel and ask you if you like to generally reflect on it. I might pick out particular bits and ask individual panel members to respond. There's been a few comments from Ruth Lovell talking about, well, something that we haven't really touched on majorly in this session, which is about nature. Ruth is talking about some of the good examples that exist in national parks and other kind of designated landscapes. There's a link that she popped in, and also talked about the National Parks Youth Committee and youth rangers uniting under the name of National Park Next Generation. So any reflections from the panel on how we do this generally in terms of nature, but how do we involve young people and their engagement in nature, would be interesting to explore. So make a note of that one, panel. Another question from Max, which Sarah, you might want to take, but also Helen as well. Public engagement is easier over tangible targets. Coping with extremes in adapting to climate change and nature recovery projects by 2030 biodiversity target easier than 2050 net zero. I probably garbled that, but is there something there around how clear do public bodies or infrastructure providers need to be with their exam question? What if the question is actually, we've got this big tangle complex problem that we're not even sure how to describe, help us with it, rather than a very precise or particular question? So perhaps reflections from Sarah or Helen on that would be great. There's a few comments around building the capacity, if I can use that hideous phrase, of communities and perhaps young people to be able to engage in this work. So any reflections from the panel on those would be interesting. And I think there was one more. Lots of you have been having a go at trying to come up with a different phrase for just transition, which is good. And yeah, I think there was one more. I might have lost it. I have. So I'll go back to the panel. Helen, can I start with you? I mean, future generation, it literally covers everything, that act.
It does, yeah.
But, isn't that overwhelming? And if that act's overwhelming and you've got to talk to the public about it,
no. It's not overwhelming. It's, well, you know, it is a big agenda, but it's all about making the connections. So if you're, you know, we're an unusual organisation in that we've got a very, very broad remit, and we're a very small organisation. We would obviously love tons more resources, but everyone's in a cash-strapped world these days. And the organisation and the Act is all about understanding the connections and unintended consequences about things, and deliberately taking, I mean, it's just a geographer's delight, isn't it? It's just taking which is why I love it so much, it's just taking a really broad perspective where, you know, early doors when you look at anything. And that's all about, you know, picking up the phone to somebody in your community or somebody in your local authority and saying, oh, we're doing X, Y, and Z. How can we do more in nature, or how can we build an apprenticeships, or how can we? So I think that broad perspective, it is a challenge, but I do sort of feel it's not an overwhelming challenge. It's just a slightly different way of thinking about how, you know, we're so used to siloed ways of thinking in government and local government, etc. It's how you see that connected picture. That's what we've got to help people to do. And I'm so glad that Ruth has mentioned nature, because in my little crib notes, I've written to myself, don't forget to mention nature, because nature and climate are one of the same thing. Nature is the best way of addressing climate change through, you know, wetlands, peat, woodlands, seagrass, etc. So, and when you see the discussion document and the evidence from the UK Climate Change Committee, and it's all great, and it's all very evidence-based and linear and all of that. But I think the danger is that we get very narrowly carried away on electric vehicle rollout, on heat pump installation, which is, you know, some of the information that's in that document. We've got to remember that we have to be making the links back to communities and back to nature as a solution here and that sort of thing. Yeah. And in terms of how we involve people, you know, we've talked a lot today about involving communities and involving young people, which are absolutely crucial, but involving people in public bodies and government that are not normally involved in climate and nature conversations is really important. So we're just starting some work looking at asset management as a profession in government and local government. Those asset managers are responsible for so many buildings, they're responsible for so much land. How can we work with asset managers to make sure that we're making progress on our climate and nature targets through how that land is managed, how those buildings are managed? And there's so much real potential there. So involving people like that in conversations is a different sort of thing, but it's also really important. I might not have answered this question.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask Rossio very quickly, if you can. There's one comment in the chat which is around the youngsters constantly, we perhaps shouldn't call them youngsters, but young people being constantly bombarded with negative messages. A lot of this stuff we are talking about is quite sad and serious. That can be quite a difficult thing to engage people on. Any reflections from you in terms of how public bodies should be having these conversations, if the conversation perhaps isn't a great conversation?
Yeah, it is really impacting on how on children and young people's mental health, and climate anxiety is definitely real and is increasing. But that doesn't mean that we can put our collective heads in the sand. So there needs to be a balance. There needs to be, we need to treat this as a real emergency that it is, and that should push us to take action. But we also need to balance that. And I think that, you know, the focus on climate action is a good one, because it does provide that hope, and that, you know, to have hope is really important, and to offer that hope, because we are, you know, Wales is leading the way in many ways, including on recycling targets and so on. So we should promote and remind children and young people of how much progress is being made, while also taking the urgent action that is necessary. But yeah, it's a balance. It's a difficult one to get completely right.
Brilliant. And Sarah, in a word or two, any thoughts on how do we have big conversations rather than very specific targeted conversations?
In response to the adaptation point.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's not harder to have a conversation about adaptation than it is about net zero with specific targets. I don't think targets are the thing. I'm running a citizens panel for Dorset Council at the minute that's looked at the whole of adaptation, and actually something that's come through really strongly there is that people see adaptation and nature in particular really going hand in hand. So I don't think it's harder. I think the same things apply. And just to nip in on the chat on the just transition point, fair, how do we get to net zero fairly is what I'd use instead. That's the language that we hear people use when they talk about just transition issues in sessions.
Brilliant. Lots of talk about time in terms of the urgency, and that time is running out for us to get ahead of the curve and doing this. Time has also got away with us for this session as well, so I'm afraid we're going to have to bring proceedings to a close. I've heard overwhelmingly that the job that we need to do in terms of net zero isn't a technical job. Actually, it's a social job, it's a people job. I think the 3 takeaway messages that I kind of jotted down was participation builds trust, and actually speed. I think we can get there quicker, perhaps if we go there more thoughtfully. That we need to design in fairness. It can't be added on as an afterthought. It has to be at the heart of this work. And actually engagement is infrastructure. It is just part of building stuff, maintaining stuff, perhaps not building stuff. Engagement is at the heart of it. This isn't the end of the conversation. I would encourage all of you to engage with the Welsh Government climate conversation work that is ongoing. So before I hand back to Stefan, I just want to say a big thank you to Helen, Rossio and Sarah for their really interesting contribution this afternoon, and a big thank you to you as well for participating. Diolch yn fawr.